I swear, if one more person tells me I should have seen it coming, I might genuinely lose it. Everyone acts like they were there, like they witnessed every tiny detail of my history with Elias, every glance he stole, every time he hovered a little too close, every late-night phone call where he soaked up my heartbreak like it was his life's purpose. They weren't. They didn't see what I saw, a sweet, dependable guy who mistook his own devotion for some epic love story. A guy who made me feel important, but not in the way I wanted. When we met as teenagers, Elias was instantly and painfully obvious about his crush. He would brighten the second I walked into a room, like someone had flipped a switch inside him. And yes, it was flattering. Anyone would enjoy being adored like that. But attraction? Actual romantic interest? No. Let's not pretend. He was awkward, always fumbling with his too big backpack, spouting trivia no one cared about, laughing at jokes that weren't remotely funny. He had that "I might write poetry about you in a notebook and never show it to anyone" energy. Too soft. Too eager. Too harmless. Meanwhile, there was Ryan. Tall. Confident. The type of man women notice when he enters a room. He was excitement wrapped in a smile and broad shoulders. So of course, when you put Elias and Ryan side by side, I knew who I wanted. Everyone loves to judge me now, but if they were honest, they'd admit they would have chosen Ryan too. But no, apparently I used Elias. As if having a friend who willingly helped me study, surprised me with lattes during finals, listened to my endless dating disasters, and loaned me money without blinking is some kind of moral crime. He offered all of that freely. I never forced him. I never manipulated him. I never promised him anything. If he wanted to interpret the occasional long hug or late-night vent session as fate tying us together with a red string, that was his fantasy, not my intention. I always knew he had feelings. I wasn't oblivious. But knowing doesn't mean I was obligated to reciprocate. I wasn't obligated to rip the hope out of him, either. If Elias wanted to spend his 20s orbiting me like I was his personal son, that was on him. The night he finally confessed? God, I remember it too well. He'd clearly rehearsed every word, voice trembling like he was proposing marriage instead of asking me on a date. It wasn't sweet. It was uncomfortable because I knew the answer was no before he even finished. He wasn't my type. He never had been. So I let him down gently because, contrary to popular belief, I'm not a heartless monster. And yet, he stayed. He kept doing all the things he always did, only now with this extra layer of pitiful hope. I didn't stop him. Why should I? It wasn't hurting me. And it wasn't hurting him either, not then. His loyalty was convenient. While Ryan gave me passion and chaos, Elias was the cushion I landed on when things fell apart. If that makes me the villain, then fine. People love a simple story with a clear bad guy. But the truth? The truth is that Elias chose to make me the center of his universe long before I ever understood what that meant. He built the pedestal. He climbed up on it. He worshipped from below. I just learned to stand still. After that confession, I honestly expected Elias to finally get a grip and move on. Most men would have. Most men do. But not him. Instead of taking the hint, he doubled down, like rejection was just another puzzle for him to solve. He became even more available, even more dependable, even more silently hopeful. And everyone loves to paint me as some evil mastermind, but really, what was I supposed to do? Push him away? Treat him cruelly just so he could heal faster? That's not who I am. I didn't create his obsession, I just existed inside it. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ryan was a roller coaster full of sparks and slammed doors, passion and disappointments. Every time he flaked, every time he forgot a date or left me in tears, Elias was there. Not asked. Not summoned. Just there. A soft knock at the door. A gentle voice asking if I was okay. A car idling outside my apartment at midnight because he had a feeling I might need him. It was maddening and comforting all at once. People talk like I used him, but what exactly is the crime in accepting support that's freely given? Elias acted like he wanted nothing more than to be the hero of my heartbreaks. He practically auditioned for the role. If he didn't want to be the reliable one, maybe he shouldn't have been so damn reliable. And I'll admit it, over time, his presence became a habit. A kind of emotional insurance policy. I didn't think about it consciously back then. It was just the rhythm of our friendship. I would fall apart, Ryan would storm off or disappear, and Elias would step into the empty space without hesitation. Always on time. Always ready. Always convinced that if he kept proving himself, I would eventually see him the way he saw me. But I didn't. Not then. Looking back, there were moments, tiny ones, where I could feel him holding his breath around me. At a coffee shop, when our hands brushed accidentally and he froze like the world had stopped turning. Or when he'd laugh a little too hard at something I said. Or the way he'd look at me, eyes soft and searching, like he was waiting for a sign I never gave. But what was I supposed to do? Break his heart every day until he left? Punish him for loving me too much? He wasn't some helpless child. He was a grown man making his own choices. And for every person who says I led him on, there were 100 signs he could have read differently. He chose not to. And then came the day Ryan decided my friendship with Elias was inappropriate. Just like that, like flipping a switch, he insisted I cut contact. At the time, it felt harsh, but also simple. I was in love with Ryan. Elias was a friend. A good friend, yes, but still just a friend. Choosing between a real relationship and a one-sided almost something didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like adulthood. So I told Elias we needed space. And he didn't fight it. Not a single argument, not even a flicker of resentment. Just quiet acceptance. A nod. A soft "I understand." As if he'd been preparing for that moment for years. And honestly, that's when I truly believed his feelings for me couldn't have been as deep as he'd pretended. Because someone who's supposedly in love with you doesn't just disappear without a word. For 8 years, he was a ghost. A holiday text here, a birthday message there, nothing more. And I lived my life, moved across the country with Ryan, built a career, made mistakes, dated other men. Elias became a quiet memory. Whatever happened to him, name I'd occasionally wonder about and then forget again. He slipped out of my life so easily. And maybe, just maybe, that should have been my first warning that nothing, absolutely nothing, was guaranteed. The day I found myself back in my hometown, I didn't expect Elias to be there. I hadn't planned on him. I hadn't imagined him stepping into my life again like a scene I'd replayed in my mind 1,000 times. But there he was, leaning against the familiar brick of the old coffee shop where we had spent hours studying and talking, his hair a little shorter, his suit sharper, the casual confidence of a man who had figured out the world without me. And for the first time, I felt the disorienting pull of nostalgia mixed with regret. It was effortless at first, like no time had passed at all. We fell back into our old rhythm: coffee, laughter, long talks about books and music, venting about work frustrations. The city around us blurred. The hum of the streets, the chatter of strangers, the scent of roasting beans in the air, it all faded into a backdrop for our reunion. I realized, with a jolt, how much I had missed the constant presence of someone who understood me without needing explanations. Who remembered my quirks, my fears, the inside jokes that didn't make sense to anyone else. Elias didn't just see me, he remembered me. And that was intoxicating. I started to notice things I hadn't before. How his eyes lingered just a fraction too long when I laughed. How he'd remember the smallest details about my life, things no one else cared enough to recall. How he carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to navigate disappointment without letting it harden him. He was still the same man who had adored me silently for decades, but now he was refined, measured, and most maddeningly aware. It wasn't desperation that glimmered in his gaze anymore. It was a controlled, calm affection that made me ache with something I couldn't name. And that's when the dangerous thoughts started creeping in. Maybe now, finally, we could be together. Maybe the timing, which had been cruel and stubborn for 20 years, had finally shifted. My heart pounded at the thought of it, like it had finally caught up to the years of waiting, the missed chances, the long nights spent thinking, he'll always be there for me. Now, I thought, maybe I could finally give him what he'd wanted all along. But Elias didn't move like I expected. He didn't lean in. He didn't echo the longing in my eyes. Instead, there was a pause. a measured quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. And in that pause, I realized how much had changed not in him, but in me. I wasn't that carefree girl who had relied on him as an emotional crutch. I had grown, and yet, I felt the old patterns pulling me toward him with all the force of memory. I started testing him gently, hinting that maybe this time we could explore more. Casual touches, lingering glances, jokes that hinted at intimacy. But Elias was careful, almost annoyingly so. He never rejected me outright, but there was no spark of eagerness either. No rushing forward. And with every cautious smile, every polite deflection, a pang of frustration and something darker, more desperate, coiled tighter in my chest. I had waited 20 years for him to love me. And now, when I was finally ready, he seemed hesitant. Hesitation became obsession. I found myself orchestrating accidental meetings, leaving notes, sending texts that walked the line between playful and confessional. I reminded him of our shared past, the countless times he had been my rock. I told him, almost pleadingly, about my health scares, about how I was rethinking everything I wanted in life. I tried to show him that my feelings were genuine, that this wasn't a fallback option anymore, it was real, finally. But his eyes didn't betray desire. They held something else, a quiet assessment, a careful weighing of what I'd done and what I'd become. And that, more than anything, was maddening. Because the Elias I knew would have leapt. Would have said yes without hesitation. And yet, he didn't. The first time Elias told me no, it was like the world tilted on its axis. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, me confessing, him pulling me close, the long-awaited spark igniting after decades of waiting. But instead, he sat across from me, calm, measured, like a man delivering a verdict rather than sharing a heart. His eyes, usually warm and endlessly patient, were steady but unyielding. "I care about you," he said softly, "but I don't think we're compatible in the ways that matter." It was such a simple sentence, so deceptively ordinary, and yet it hit me like a bullet. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind scrambled, desperate to protest, to argue, to remind him of everything, the years of loyalty, the nights he stayed up talking me through heartbreaks that weren't even his own, the countless ways he had shaped my life just by being present. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a creeping, gnawing shame. All those years of treating him like a safety net, a backup plan, suddenly seemed grotesque. I had convinced myself that what I was doing was harmless, that I was being a good friend, as if devotion could exist in a vacuum, as if my convenience didn't come at the cost of someone else's heart. And now, staring at the calm certainty in his eyes, I realized that the scales had shifted. Elias had grown. Not just taller, more confident, more composed, but stronger in ways I had never expected. He had learned that his loyalty wasn't a weapon to be exploited, that his patience had limits, that love without respect for himself was hollow. He had built walls around his heart where I had assumed none would ever exist. And I had waited too long. I tried to explain myself, to plead, to find a crack in the armor. I told him I had changed, that I was serious now, that I could finally see what I had been blind to all those years. I brought up our history, our shared moments, my quiet victories and defeats that he had witnessed with unwavering attention. I tried to make him see that this was not desperation, it was recognition, realization, finally. He listened, always so patient, like he had always been. But every time I spoke, I felt him subtly retreat, not in space, but in essence. There was no spark of rekindled longing, no trace of the obsessive admiration that had defined him for 2 decades. Just a steady, polite detachment that tore at my nerves. "I've moved on," he said finally, with a weightless tone that made it worse. "I'm happy. I'm building something real, something mutual." That sentence, so simple, should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It was the final proof of my failure. I had spent 20 years assuming he would always wait, always be there, always adore me. And now, when I finally opened the door, it was too late. He had already crossed the threshold into a life that didn't include me. I left that day feeling hollow, like I had wandered into a room I had built in my imagination and found it empty, stripped of all meaning. The streets felt alien. The familiar skyline seemed distant, indifferent. Every memory of our friendship, the laughter, the late-night talks, the small rituals of care, was now tinged with a bitter sense of misplacement, like artifacts from a life that had never truly been mine to claim. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction since our reunion. I traced the lines of every text, every conversation, every subtle hesitation. I wondered when exactly he had stopped seeing me as potential, when he had started building boundaries I couldn't cross. Every memory became a knife, every gesture a reminder that love cannot be forced, cannot be manipulated, cannot be manufactured with timing and persistence. And then came the realization that stabbed deeper than any rejection. Elias hadn't rejected me because he didn't love me anymore. He had rejected me because he had grown beyond the version of me that needed to rely on him. He had developed standards, and I wasn't the partner he wanted. I had been training wheels for the man he was becoming, and I had only noticed too late. The irony was unbearable. I had spent decades thinking I held the cards, thinking that time was on my side, thinking he would always be waiting. And now I understood that life had been dealing the cards all along, and I had folded too soon, too selfishly. The weeks after our conversation felt like wandering through a fog that wouldn't lift. Elias wasn't cruel. He hadn't slammed a door in my face, hadn't yelled or screamed, but his calm detachment cut sharper than any argument. I could feel him slipping further away with each passing day, not through any action, but simply by existing on his own terms. And me? I was left scrambling, chasing shadows, trying to catch the ghost of someone who had already moved on. I found myself tracing back through the years, cataloging every instance I had leaned on him, every time I had treated his devotion as a cushion while I sought excitement elsewhere. And the guilt was suffocating. I remembered the way he'd shown up with coffee at dawn during finals, how he had waited for me to finish my drama with other men, how he'd quietly loaned me money when I had nothing to my name. Every memory felt like a litany of betrayal, even though I hadn't meant it that way at the time. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to scream, to pound my fists on the walls of my apartment, to make him feel the weight of the years I had stolen, the emotions I had toyed with. But I couldn't. Because even in his rejection, even in the polite distance he now maintained, he had this strange, quiet dignity. He hadn't mocked me, hadn't scorned me, hadn't made a spectacle of my desperation. He had simply drawn a line, and for all my fury, all my entitlement, I had to acknowledge the truth. He was right. There were moments I thought I could trick myself into believing he might still come back. A brief text, a lingering glance during a coincidental encounter, even the faintest echo of his old patience, all of it was enough to ignite hope, foolish hope, like a candle flickering against the wind. But every time I tried to reach for him, I was reminded that the man I had spent 20 years imagining as eternally mine had become someone else. Someone with his own life, his own choices, his own boundaries. And then I saw her. Her name was Clara, and she appeared like a shadow crossing the sun I had been standing under for so long. Elias had been seeing her for 18 months. It wasn't a rumor or a misheard story or some distant abstraction. I had looked. I had studied the photos, the captions, the moments that weren't meant for me. And the sight cut me open in a way I couldn't have anticipated. She was ordinary in ways I hadn't expected, sweet, friendly, pleasant. Not exceptional, not glamorous, certainly not the idealized version of myself I had imagined as a competitor. And yet, there they were, laughing together, radiating ease and connection, and I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that I had never seen him look at me that way, not with that kind of contentment, not with that sense of completion. I had assumed my place in his life was permanent, that our history was a fortress no one else could breach. But life had moved quietly around me, building a world I was no longer part of. I replayed every interaction, every subtle hesitation, every polite deflection he had made since our reunion. It all aligned like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve. I had been desperate, chasing a version of him that only existed in memory, while he had already claimed a reality that I could never enter. And that, more than anything, was unbearable. Sleep became a stranger. My apartment felt smaller. the walls pressing in with unspoken accusations. Every song on the radio, every couple passing hand in hand, every little reminder of normal, happy life seemed like a personal indictment. I had spent decades prioritizing convenience, excitement, and selfish comfort over loyalty and love, and now I was left to sit with the echoes of what I had squandered. I tried to tell myself it was just timing, that I would find someone new, that the universe had other plans. But deep down, I knew the cruelest truth. Elias hadn't just rejected me. He had completely rewritten our history, erased me from the story I had been living for 20 years, and moved forward without a backward glance. And for the first time, I understood the cost of taking someone for granted. Days blurred into nights, and the quiet spaces of my apartment began to feel like a courtroom where I was both defendant and prosecutor. Every thought about Elias was a charge against myself. 20 years of using him, leaning on him, pretending that I didn't notice how much he loved me. The irony of it was suffocating. I had finally realized my feelings too late, and the universe had delivered its own verdict with merciless precision. I walked the streets near my old neighborhood, where the memories of him were almost tactile. The corner coffee shop where he had once insisted on buying me a caramel latte every Thursday, even when I protested. The little park where we had spent summers lying on the grass, him patiently listening to me rant about the latest drama in my life. The library steps where I had laughed at his awkward jokes, blissfully unaware or unwilling to acknowledge how much he adored me. Every place was a reminder that I had him in my orbit, unwavering and constant, while I floated between storms that never lasted. And then there was the haunting reality. I wasn't just alone. I was starting over at an age where the safety nets I had once relied on were gone. My health issues, mild at first, had become more intrusive, limiting my options, sapping energy and confidence, and whispering bitterly in my ear that the choices I had made or failed to make had consequences far beyond the emotional. I thought about dating, about relationships, about trying to carve a space in a world that had moved on without me. But the thought felt heavy, like trying to lift a stone that had been embedded in the riverbed for decades. I remembered the small kindnesses I had taken for granted, the late-night texts, the hours spent listening without judgment, the unwavering support through heartbreaks I thought were important because they excited me. Those things had been invisible to me then, and now they were magnified into a kind of haunting clarity. Elias hadn't just been a friend. He had been my constant, my safe harbor, my invisible anchor. And I had abandoned him in pursuit of storms that never lasted. Then came the social media announcement. An engagement. 18 months of a relationship, culminating in the kind of joy I had imagined for myself with him. I studied the photos obsessively, noting the tilt of his head as he laughed at Clara's joke, the way his hand rested comfortably on her shoulder, the genuine ease in his posture. Not once did he glance in my direction. Not once did the past we shared flicker in his expression. And in that moment, the truth hit me with brutal clarity. I had been nothing more than a placeholder. A lesson. A rehearsal for the life he had been meant to have all along. Anger bubbled in me first, sharp and fiery. I wanted to confront him, demand answers, scream about 20 years of devotion and loyalty that had been erased with a few polite words. But then the anger dissolved into an unfamiliar ache, grief, pure and unrelenting. I wasn't mourning a relationship I had failed to start. I was mourning the loss of the person I had believed he was to me, the safety net I had assumed was infinite. And no amount of reasoning could stitch that tear in my life. I realized bitterly that I couldn't blame him. He had lived his life fully, while I had clung to the illusion that he would always be mine. I had the chance, multiple chances, and I had chosen comfort over courage, excitement over depth. The universe hadn't cheated me, I had. And now, as I scrolled past the happy couple, as the engagement ring glinted in the sunlight and his smile was brighter than it had ever been for me, I understood that some opportunities were once in a lifetime, and I had let mine slip quietly away, like sand through fingers. The city carried on around me indifferent. Couples laughed, children played, strangers moved with purpose while I lingered in the shadow of my mistakes. I thought about starting over, about trying to reclaim some semblance of life that felt whole, but the weight of regret was heavy, and the path forward seemed jagged and uncertain. And still, in the recesses of my mind, I couldn't stop picturing him with her, his life, his joy, the love I had ignored for too long. The months that followed felt like living underwater. Every movement was slow, weighted by the gravity of my choices, by the echo of the life I had neglected to seize. I kept busy, trying to build a structure of meaning from the rubble of my own decisions, work, friends, hobbies, but the shadow of Elias lingered, persistent and unyielding. Even when I forced myself to laugh, to make plans, to care about something beyond myself, there was this quiet, insistent whisper, "You could have had him. You let him go." I tried dating again, tentatively at first. Men who were kind, men who were funny, men who carried no baggage I couldn't handle, but none of them sparked anything close to what I had imagined with Elias. There was no understanding, no depth that matched decades of shared history. And the older I got, the more I realized that time was no longer on my side. Each passing day reminded me that youth, vitality, and second chances were not infinite, that the world was not waiting for me to catch up. My body reminded me with aches and fatigue. My mind reminded me with sharp pangs of regret. My heart reminded me with an emptiness that no casual connection could fill. Then came the birthdays, the holidays, the anniversaries, the markers of life passing relentlessly. I would catch a glimpse of a photo of Elias online and freeze, my chest tightening. He looked happy, and in his smile, in the way he held Clara's hand, there was a contentment that wasn't meant for me. My reflection in the mirror felt like a stranger's, older, wearier, carrying invisible scars from a war of indecision I had waged alone. I remembered every late-night conversation, every favor, every gesture I had once assumed was mine to claim, and I realized that none of it had been enough, not for him, not for the universe, not even for me. And yet, in the quiet moments, I hated myself less and understood more. Elias had loved me, yes, but he had also moved on. He had found his life, his happiness, in someone else. That was not betrayal, it was life. And me? I had to find a way to live with the choices I had made. I had to rebuild, not from the ruins of what might have been, but from the reality of what was. Painful as it was, there was clarity in that. My regrets were mine alone, and my future, though scarred, still held space for something I could claim if I dared. There were moments of loneliness that cut sharp, when I lay awake at night replaying every conversation, every gesture, every missed opportunity. I wondered if I would ever forgive myself for being careless with someone who had given me everything without asking for more. But there was also a fragile thread of hope threading through the ache. If I could survive this, if I could face the truth of my own choices, maybe I could learn to live fully without relying on anyone else's constancy. Maybe I could find a love that began with honesty rather than convenience, depth rather than security. Life had stripped me bare, and for a long time, I thought that meant I had nothing left. But slowly, painfully, I realized it also meant I could rebuild on my terms, without illusions, without the crutch of a safety net that I had assumed would last forever. The city's lights flickered through my apartment window that night, and I let myself imagine a future that didn't revolve around regret or lost love. A life where I could exist for myself, and not just in the shadow of what I had missed. Elias would always be a part of my story, the ghost of what I had ignored and then tried to reclaim. But he was not my ending. And maybe, finally, I was ready to start writing the chapters that were mine alone. The truth was bitter, but also liberating. I had lost him, yes. But I hadn't lost myself. Not yet.